nice to have you here. First, as a disclaimer, Larry and Stephen and I, we go back a long, long, long time. It wouldn't flatter anyone on the call to count the years, but I mean, we've been working together for a long time. So nice to have you guys. This episode is about this book. It's being published by our friend Steve and Larry. Larry has been with Microsoft for a very long time. Steve is still enjoying the perks of being with Microsoft. Both very much involved in the migration business. I thought, I'm maybe a bit naive there, in due time, I used to think that you were both much more involved with the mainframe than with any other platform. But when I read this book, that was one of the things I noticed. It was about way more than the mainframe. The mainframe is an important topic, but by no means the only one that you go over on this book. So I'll just give my take on the book for a sec, and then I'll get back to you. This is very much the way I looked at it. It was a way of scanning a number of technologies as source technologies, typical issues that people have with legacy systems in a broad sense. I mean, legacy, they don't really have to be old, but they may be on platforms that you, for some kind of reason, no longer want to use. Scanning all these technologies and describing what Azure offers as possible target equivalent and how to best go there, right? Let's take the helicopter view. That's what those 200 pages seem to tell me, is that, well, if you've got this, these are your options. If you've got this, these are your options. And look at this, Azure, you've got these capabilities. I'm oversimplifying, but that's how I understood it. And to me, it was really nice because, obviously I have a long-standing relationship with Microsoft. I'm being fed with the Microsoft gospel on a very regular basis, but that doesn't mean I remember everything I'm told, or as my wife would say, that I even understand everything I'm told. So it was really nice to have, let's say, a mapping between all those terms that I sometimes see in marketing material and some reality that is closer to my heart, without saying, okay, so that was really nice for me. So this is my understanding, this is my appreciation. Do you agree, disagree, would you like to say more or less?
Well, I think you've covered it fairly well. I mean, the idea behind this was to cover the scope of what are possible legacy, transformations. Now, 200 pages, you're not going to be able to go into in depth in any particular one. That doesn't mean we can't go into a little bit more depth in the areas that we think are the ones that more people are used to. And the other thing is making sure people understand some of the terminology, just like you were saying, about what is a migration. For instance, Steve and I hear people talk about mainframes. Well, I usually think of Z systems when I hear the term mainframe, but that's not necessarily how all people think about it. So therefore, we wanted to cover all the various pieces of it. I know people, IBM systems like AIX, the Unix, and also the I-series, the old AS400s, they think those are mainframes too, and to them they probably are, but we wanted to make sure they understood if you have an AS400, for instance, you do not take the approach that you would take with the Z system. So that was sort of the idea behind it, and then we would have the opportunity in subsequent books possibly to go into more depth depending on how this one is received and that kind of thing. Steve, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what we did in this book was really sort of take our travels and tribulations as far as working in this particular space, and take a lot of the questions that customers had asked us as far as, all right, exactly what you just said. Like, they would think they had a mainframe, and we'd find out it was a legacy Unix box, and to us that's not a mainframe. To them it was, right? So this book was really sort of, I think the high-level intent was to level set and to get the semantics straight and answer a lot of those questions that people that are decision makers have, to sort of streamline the whole decision process of migration.
And one other thing I would say that's sort of a common theme through all of this is how to approach this, regardless of the technology that you're coming from. Because I think there's some common threads about that, understanding what you have, right? What the target is, and then how to get from here to there. I know I'm oversimplifying, but that's in essence, the idea here is that if we can sort of use that as a framework, we can then take the various technologies and see how to best get it to the target platform. Now, oddly enough, the target platform, for instance, for an enterprise Unix system, might be very similar to the target infrastructure, that is, for being on Azure. The difference is what type of technologies are loaded onto that infrastructure. So that the book is meant to talk about those kinds of things to get you up and running, because ultimately, you're kind of probably wind up with some type of app server, some kind of UI layer, and some kind of database. I mean, regardless of this, and then how is the best way to host that based on the capabilities of those systems?
So you covered tons of technology. Obviously, I mean, anyone who knows me a little bit knows that my domain of interest is obviously more the mainframe than Unix boxes and I series. If you were to give, let's say, in a few sentences, the major differences between those three classes, let's say, I know that you can then say AIX is a separate beast and so on, but let's say Unix boxes, I series, and mainframe. You want to say, well, from a distance, what is specific about each of these workloads?
Interesting. I'm actually going to do it in the order of what I think is probably, the most restrictive to the more wide open spaces. So I would start with the I series. The I series, it's done a certain way. You use certain tools. You deviate from that, it's probably not going to work. So, you pretty much have a self-contained environment with the I series, and you have to find a way to deal with that. Mainframes are less so, but they still come with sets of tools that you have to understand what they are and their functionality in order to replicate that over, regardless of how you want to replicate that over. And then finally, if you're getting into enterprise Unix, it could be almost anything. People did a lot of interesting things, because that's when people kind of went crazy with what we called back then open systems. Open systems simply meant it could run on different types of hardware back in those days, and that's the 80s, by the way. But those are the things that sort of stood out to me, is kind of looking at the platform you're starting from and what are the characteristics of each one of those, and how much to expect as far as what to find and that sort of thing. So that's sort of my thought on those three. Now, they all could potentially do similar things. With that said, you typically would get the older mission critical, et cetera, workloads that are large on the Z series, the mainframes, and you would, but you could also find ones that are very mission critical on the I series. And on the Unix, especially enterprise Unix, for instance, something like SAP, people aren't going to say that's not mission critical. And, even though you can run it on mainframes, it's predominantly, a more of a Unix Windows kind of a base platform. So those are my thoughts. Steve, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, from a Microsoft perspective, I'm sure we all know on this call, and maybe some folks watching this don't, that Microsoft in and of itself has solutions for mainframe integration, but nothing really for what we were talking about in this book. We have a great platform with Azure, but sort of like piling onto what you just said, I think that a lot of this book was trying to be very agnostic of the the ISVs and the like yourself, and just sort of take the high road of like, all right, this is how you would approach this if it was a mainframe. If it's mid-range, then there's a lot of different options that you could look at. But again, you're probably going to be looking at some vendor solutions for that, right? And so what we tried to do is sort of thread the needle as far as, all right, for this particular this particular platform, depending on what you want to end up, this is like rehost, refactor, that type of approach. And obviously that's different for the different platforms, right? Because when you get into legacy Unix, then it's like we're using web applications sphere or things like that, where you had Java running on a mainframe, so that would dictate your approach that you might take.
Right, and we did try to not we didn't. I don't think we used an ISV's actual name once in that book, but I think
Not even Raincoat, as a matter of fact.
I know.
right.
I started with the index, and then Raincoat was not mentioned. I said, okay.
Yeah, but neither was any other. But I think you could, if you read part of it, you could see what applied to Raincoat, because there were
Oh,
parts that
absolutely.
specifically applied to Raincoat. So,
If you ask if I were to give a criticism, that would be it. The fact that it's truly agnostic. So I'm pretty sure you have opinions. I'm not going to grill you here to get them, but you make sure say, okay, these are the facts, these are the things, and nobody's good, nobody's bad. You stay away from controversy. Larry, you know me. I'm not very good at that. So you did good there. Because, for instance, you mentioned iSeries. Whenever people talk to me about iSeries, say, well, iSeries, part of the problem is that 90+% of the workloads there are written in RPG, and RPG is a language which model is pretty much a dead end. You could argue quite rightly so that COBOL is an old language, but there is still future in COBOL. There are COBOL vendors, there are COBOL people, there are COBOL training, so on. RPG is a language that is really the end of that kind of language, not just RPG itself. So it's really hard. Something that struck me is that the book has two different kind of things coexist. There are like very old things. You talk about mainframe, talking from the 70s, the 80s. Some of the concepts you mentioned are older than us, and that's not a simple feat in the IT world. And then you map them to Azure, and Azure is still very much a moving target. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the fact that part of the thing that you mentioned in this book may become obsolete or incomplete, let's say in the coming couple of years? Do you intend to have a second edition? Do you intend to second, third, and more? I mean, do you have good specific plans in that area?
Well, we have already talked to the publisher that, by the time it's, generally available, of course, some things are going to be obsolete, and we should have a follow-up to that. And also, we need to go into more depth in any given technology. So the fact that we stayed at the helicopter level, to use your terminology, I think helped us a little bit there, because we didn't have to go into some of the minutia of how to implement things on Azure. However, we did deliberately look towards what we believe to be the platform as a service type things that would be going forward in Azure, regardless of what we called it. I still think of myself as Microsoft. They may change the name, but it's essentially a similar technology, and there's a migration path. So we tried to stick to things, at least from our point of view, of what we thought was the right way to go, of going that way. I mean, the biggest issue that you can do is do an all IaaS approach, because that's the stuff where VMs go in and out of VM series. We're changing all the time. And you want to have it so you abstract yourself somewhat from that layer. We hope we did that. I'm not sure we were perfect, but that's how we tried to make it such that it could be transitioned into the future as Azure grows and things like that. The most interesting piece is how other things that Microsoft are doing are going to come into the picture. For instance, you never talked much about artificial intelligence with mainframe customers, at least I didn't initially. Now, before I left Microsoft, this is just recently, everyone wanted to know how that fit into the puzzle. So you actually have to be able to talk to that today. Some places it fits, some places it doesn't. You and I've had that discussion. So that's where I also think, given the opportunity, we could go into more detail and that kind of thing. So, I've talked a lot, Steve. Why don't you?
Yeah, I think you nailed it in that we wrote this book at a very interesting time for Microsoft. One, I remember when we were putting together the Azure chapters, we wanted to put together sort of like this two chapters, kind of high level, like this is Azure, and this is what containers are. This is the different implementations or services and solutions that you can use for containers. And what struck me when we were doing that is that there were some technologies that were deprecated, right? So we couldn't talk about container instances, right? I think that was one of them that sort of got deprecated. So we really sort of had to go, all right, that's not a thing anymore. That got rolled into this. So there was a lot of sort of just mapping the Azure stack together. And then Copilot and ChatGPT, OpenAI. When we started writing this book, that stuff was not mainstream or known at all. And then towards the end of this book, it became like a really big deal, right? Where people were starting to do some refactoring with Copilot for GitHub and things like that. So I think the approach that we took was, well, this is definitely going to be really big. Let's put it all into the book, into a chapter, and maybe we can hop into this in a lot more depth, in a future book. So yeah, it was an interesting time, I think, when we wrote this book, because a lot of things were happening.
Well, just to add to that last chapter where we talked about the futures, we actually, went to the trouble of saying, okay, don't not do something because the future, because that's not going to help you any. The future, there's always going to be changes in the future. It's how do you position yourself to best take advantage of it. So that's what we tried to bring across, and I think we did a pretty good job with it.
Yeah, I don't want this to be, I don't want you guys to be caught by surprise, but I'm almost tempted to say, okay, but now that all this thing has evolved and we've got a little bit of history with this, I'm so tempted to say, okay, what do you think about AI here and now? But I don't want you to be caught by surprise. I mean, that would be unfair, because you're right. It's a conversation we have like all the time, and people have very unreasonable and educated expectations regarding it. And we sometimes hear CIOs saying, oh, this is, I'm going to just freeze this in 1 year time. AI is going to be able to do this all automatically. I say, well, good luck with that. But
well, I would agree. One of the things when people talk about AI, I'm saying, well, how are you applying the AI? You have to go back to what I'm trying to solve here. If you just want AI to run everything for you, well, it's going to do it its way, which may or may not be what you want. So there's things that you have to sort of look at a little bit. And so, I think we're planning to cover that, if we go ahead with a future book.
Yeah, there's a lot of level setting with AI discussions I'm finding where exactly that, where people think it's sort of like a magic genie, and we have to level set and let them know that no, it's not quite that. It can definitely help, and speed up a lot of things, but it's not it's not at that level that I think the hype has sort of suggested.
yeah, the hype is for real. There's no question about that. And then I wonder, so the book has been out for a few months now. What kind of feedback did you get?
Well, all the feedback we've gotten have been very positive. But so can't say everybody's. Our friends at AWS, I'm not sure I've gotten a lot of feedback from them and things like that. So again, the biggest issue with it is when does it become, obsolete? That said, I have a white paper I wrote in, let's see, I guess it's 5 years ago now. It was in 2018.
Demystifying?
Demystifying. Yeah. That's still being used. So there might be some fundamental things that might still be useful in it if, for instance, the actual name of what type of container instance that we're using now and what we call it versus the concept of what containers can bring to the table.
I wondered, I think, please tell me I'm wrong if I am, but I think I read very explicitly that the entire book is available for download as a PDF file.
Yes.
Is that a way for you to address obsolescence, at least to some degree? Say, well, we can make minor changes and then let people download it. Or you say, no, I'm totally out of breath. I'm not working on this right now.
Well, we would have to work with the editors to see what they wanted to do, because ultimately, it's PAC-T is the one who is the publisher, and they would say, and they get feedback too, by the way. So, they might get feedback that says, hey, chapter 6, I'm just picking on that, not necessarily even remembering what it covered, needs to be updated. That's feedback that we've gotten. Well, fine, since we wrote them that way. I mean, every chapter is a separate, Word document. So that was interesting too, collaborating with Steve to write the chapters because, we don't live in the same city, right? So therefore, we were doing that all online to put it together. We'd sort of put together an outline and then split it up and then weave it back together, and hopefully it still flows. So that was sort of an interesting thing too.
I think we both fell in love with Google Docs. It was nice, and one other thing I'll just mention alongside that is that kudos to all the people that reviewed this. Bob Ellsworth, of course, did the foreword, which is great, and did a great job on that. But we had some really good peer reviewers that we picked out, and they pointed out a lot of things that were inconsistent. Maybe hey, you might want to say this. So it was really good to have that as far as another pair of eyes looking at this.
Well, making sure you're keeping the terminology consistent. That was a theme. Okay. In Chapter 8, make sure it's using the same terminology for specific technologies you did in Chapter 5, for instance.
And it's true that the list of reviewers reads like a who's who of mainframe-related people at Microsoft.
It was.
Well, we would think so.
Yeah, there are not many names missing, and pretty much everybody's there. So that's really impressive. And what are your plans from now? I mean, based on the feedback, would you do things differently? Do you intend to do a follow-up, something more focused, or even less focused, or just rest? Because I understand that it's an ordeal. It's a project. It's an endeavor, and at some point you may say, well, I feel like leaving it there for a year, and then we'll see.
I'll take a stab at that, Larry. And then, because I think where we left it was, all right, there's a lot more we could say, especially with Copilot and some of the, things that are on the horizon. So we pretty much floated the idea to PAC-T that, this was very much, like you said, a helicopter view flyby. There's a lot of things to me, one of the things that we worked on was the decomposition of a monolith, right? And so we devoted, I think, maybe 1, maybe 2 chapters to that, but it wasn't really, it was very, very high level. Like, these are the things you want to look out for. I think going back and doing some of that in more depth and definitely plugging into Copilot from a Microsoft perspective, going to Azure is something that they would be receptive to perhaps publishing another edition for this.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is definitely more detail in specific areas because we got pretty light when I would consider the actual implementation parts of doing a Z-series, for instance. I think we did a pretty good job of discussing the overall things that you have to look out for and things that you should work with and the basics of what the architecture would be and how to map the technologies. Actually implementing the technologies, you just couldn't do that in the number of pages we had. So I think maybe we would take a couple of the topics, and I think Z-series is one of them, and maybe Enterprise Unix is the other, to go into more depth for doing. And I wouldn't combine them. In other words, I'd have one book that's strictly Z-series and another book that's strictly Enterprise Unix. So those are my thoughts beyond the fact of the futures, that's bringing in with AI, everything, and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of material. You could write dozens of books by just looking at all these things. Steve, Larry, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really happy and I'm proud to be able to talk about this book on this podcast. This has been great.